Yes, it was Zoom. Zoom booted me out. It often does that to my students. You've all had that experience. The only negative thing about any kind of online teaching is that you can't control things like that. I almost panicked. I thought my laptop had died. No, it ain't my laptop. I've had it charged and completely, serviced. I know it's not the laptop. Good to see you. Thank you for your persistence. Let's get back to, I'm going to start over with these elements because the only good thing is at least the entire 10 elements were still yet to be described. Let's go back to where we were. I know we'll be getting a few more people, right? Hopefully. And if not, those others who might not have figured out what was going on will still be able to see this on YouTube by 8 p.m. Friday. So going to stand up. I know it's an odd angle because I'm a little tall for face, but at least you can now. Let's see. I'm just seeing if there's anyone else to admit. I'm sure we'll get a few more joining us.
Mark, real quick before you start, when you open the second video, like you uploaded the second video, I believe you uploaded the intro a second time instead of the second lecture, like the first lecture, I mean.
Oh.
So when I went into the YouTube, it was the intro. So it was twice.
Yeah.
I found that too, and I needed it because I had technical.
Thank you. Wait, you know what? That's happened about once a year, and I'm not going to deny that it probably is just one of those sleepless. I was trying to get it done on about 11:30 p.m. on Thursday, so I didn't have to do it Friday. I should have not done it when I wasn't fully awake. So I apologize, and I can easily redo that. Just send me an email as a reminder, please, and I'll do that today.
Okie dokie.
I'll delete the wrong one and post the correct one, but I can't guarantee I'll do it at 5. It might be by tomorrow. You'll be able to see that. Okay, I'll do it tonight. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, back to the board here, and let's do this in the right order where we were before we were so rudely interrupted. At least we didn't get Zoom bombed, right? Which would have been a big problem. Now I can't find my pointer because I was rushing around trying to see if it was just a loose cord or something. Well, let's just do this. I will use the smallest type of pointer, but it'll work. Okay, we were just about to do, and now we'll just do this balance. I already described what it was, but in case for some reason it didn't get through to all of you. Balance is when you look at a composition, a visual work of art, and decide are they equal or roughly equal areas of objects from either the top to the bottom or not either, but top to bottom and from left to right. The only way to do that is this grid pattern, as I just started to describe, is to draw and imagine in your mind, obviously, an imaginary grid pattern and make it into quadrants. And then you look at the objects in that work of art or parts of that work of art and decide if they're evenly balanced or roughly balanced from left to right and top to bottom. As I was saying before the interruption, this work of art has two, I call these jellyfish for lack of a better term for these objects I drew. So you have two objects above the middle line, and then from left to right, you've got two on the left and two on the right. So as I was just about to ask, based on what I just said, the definition of balance is, and what you see on that diagram, would you say that work of art is balanced? Anybody? I'm encouraging participation, but
yes, I would say it's balanced.
Yeah, it is. It's balanced both ways. I deliberately start with this, and then I'll change that to show you what it looks like if it's unbalanced. Okay, so we have an even number or equal number of objects, roughly the same size, not exact, but very close, from left to right, right? Two on the left, two on the right. So that's how you'd write about it. You'd say this work of art is balanced, or if you prefer to say roughly balanced. Some works of art are absolutely symmetrical, right? Everyone knows the word symmetrical, right? If they're symmetrical, completely balanced, like some architecture, some sculpture of human bodies and so forth, and even some paintings, if they're exactly the same number of objects and same sizes of objects on the left and right and top to bottom, then it's totally balanced. But usually things are more roughly balanced. And so you need to use your powers of discerning, of looking at things to see, is it roughly balanced? Yes, it clearly is, because there are two objects, in this case, we'll say jellyfish on the left and two on the right, making it balanced from left to right. And then you need to give 3 examples of what you see, at least 2, sorry, at least 2, and usually 3, if there are 3, because usually a work of art isn't this simple. I'm making it very simple just to get started with this concept. Okay, so then if you just were talking about this one work of art, you'd say it's balanced from top to bottom as well in a separate sentence. And you need to say why. If all you say in your papers or essay answers on your exams is, this is a balanced work of art, period, and you won't get a passing grade because it's not an analysis. That's just listing. And here we do a little bit of analysis on each of these 10 elements. In other words, you need to give examples of why something is balanced, which is what I'm just doing. So to finish up with this one, you'd say, yes, it is balanced left to right because there's equal numbers of jellyfish, 2 each on the left and 2 on the right. Also, second sentence, it is balanced top to bottom because there are 2 jellyfish above the middle and 2 below. Now, pause. Any question before we go on to an unbalanced example?
Real quick, I think there are still some people stuck in the waiting room.
It's not showing up on my screen. I believe you totally. It just says, why is it not? Oh, okay. Thank you. That's helpful because it's not showing up another slight discrepancy here.
Yeah.
Do we get?
As some people are saying in the Discord that, oh, I'm stuck at the waiting room. Is it?
Yeah, no,
time?
thank you. Thank you. I didn't see that because obviously I'm focusing on the board. I was looking at the bottom of my screen where it said 27, and then suddenly it went to 32 when you mentioned that. Thank you. That's very helpful for your fellow students and me, of course, so I don't miss helping people totally, at least those who are attending today, get through.
I didn't want to interrupt. I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. All right, so now hopefully I don't see it says 32 participants and I just hit admit all. So hopefully that doesn't leave anyone out in the cold. All right, let's then do an example of something that's unbalanced. Okay, so I'm going to use the eraser on this whiteboard, and then I'll just do this and you'll see what I mean. I think because we're running shorter on time, it's probably going to go to 4:30. We need to cover this today though. And then of course you can review it by both reading Sarah Gill's chapters on each of these elements and watching the video on Friday on YouTube after 8 p.m. All right, now is this balance? Well, let's see. There's only 1 jellyfish or object above the middle line and 2 below. So that means it's what?
Imbalance.
Unbalanced toward the bottom. You want to say it that way. Why? That would be where you get the full credit and an A or so on your essays if you're writing the section on formal analysis. This is what that means. Formal analysis is when you describe and analyze the different elements you see in a work of art that you're writing about. Okay, that is called formal analysis. We'll talk about how to write the papers next week. Okay, so what do we say? It's unbalanced toward the bottom because there are 2 jellyfish or objects below the middle and only 1 above. How about left to right? Well, obviously it's unbalanced toward the right because there are 2 objects or jellyfish on the right and only 1 on the left. I think you get the idea. But just one last little thing, and then I don't have to draw on the board because it shakes a lot here. It just fits in the space in my bedroom where I hung it, as you can see from the picture railing. This is an old house, it's 1923, 100 years old next year. So we have picture railing, useful. All right, now is it balanced?
Yeah.
Carefully, anybody?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think somebody said yes, right? I'm going to take that as a yes. Because now, even though they're at different corners, that's not the point you look at. You look at the midlines, left to right, right? And top to bottom. And clearly you've got 1 object above the middle and 1 below, and then 1 on the left, 1 on the right. So it is roughly balanced. Okay. So now let's talk about one of the other, I'd say the first 2 objects, you don't have to follow the order in which this handout, and once again, that's right, the list of 10 terms that we're covering today. You don't have to follow the order in which they're listed here or on this whiteboard. That's up to you, but you do need to cover all of them if you want an A, all 10. All right, so I'm going now back on this one. Is number 1 is dynamic versus stable. This one's pretty easy, and I don't need to illustrate it, but I'll give you examples. Dynamic versus stable is when you look at a work of art and you ask yourself, are there two or more diagonal and or it could be both curved lines in that or any part of a work of art? Well, if there are at least two or more curved or diagonal lines in the entire work of art or any part of it, that section of that painting or drawing or photo building, whatever it is, would be considered dynamic. In other words, dynamic is the presence in visual formal analysis of visual art, means the presence of two or more diagonal and or curved lines. Now, what's the opposite of dynamic? We kind of touched on it with that lecture that I now need to repost, I guess, on Wednesday, which is that would be when there are only straight lines or right angles in part of a work of art or all of a work of art. It should be obvious, but if it isn't, I'll make sure this is clear for you now before you start asking yourself, well, what about works of art that have both? Well, most works of art have sections that are dynamic or parts of them, and parts or sections, meaning objects in a painting or drawing or photo, or in a building, a section of the building. Some parts might be stable, some might be dynamic. So it's your job to cite at least, you have to give 3 examples. That is the rule for now, because the papers have become twice the minimum length is now at least 4 pages. That's not that long for a research paper I'm talking about. So if you want to get an A, you would need to give at least 3 examples. Well, most works of art are going to have some parts that are dynamic and some that are stable. And that's important because then you'll have no problem finding at least 3 examples. Usually there's 2 or 3 parts or more that are stable and that many or more that are dynamic. And you just describe, say, 3 of those in a full sentence on the element of stable versus dynamic. Okay, now I know this is early on, it's the beginning, unless you don't know these terms from experience yet, but it'll be clear as we go along when you read Sarah Gill's book and also maybe rewatch this video on YouTube. Okay, rhythm is a pretty easy one too, because it's pretty straightforward, but one of your fellow students brought this up and I'm glad she did on, I think it was Monday, our first class, about rhythm. Why have rhythm? Okay, but here's the definition of rhythm in a visual. We're not about musical rhythm, obviously. In a visual work of art, rhythm is the presence of 2 or more repeated or similar shapes that would create rhythm. Well, a good example of that would be a painting of a crowd. There are all kinds of things, a battle scene, or maybe the crucifixion of Jesus, or some other group portrait of people, rulers of a kingdom, whatever it is, a royal family portrait with the king, the queen, and all the children and members of the family. So if you have a painting that is of several human bodies included, or a drawing or a photo or a piece of sculpture that has more than one human body, by definition it has rhythm. It's true, obviously not all human bodies are exactly the same, but if they're intact, right, normally all human bodies going to have a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs. Right there, 2 people side by side or back to back, whatever, in the same image, a painting, photo, whatever it is. That definition, by definition, it is automatically an example of rhythm. What about a portrait? Let's take a portrait. Some of you may know this, of Henry VIII. He was, the monster that, really terrible person, but a very, important person in the history of the British Isles. Of course, he was one of those famous rulers. There have been movies, documentaries about. You may have seen, some of you, there are several paintings of him in art. I think there's one in Stockstead. I don't use it in the class, but let's just say you have a portrait of a king. Doesn't matter who it is, it could be Henry VIII. And you just see the top part of his body, roughly from about where I am visible, shoulders and neck. That's if it was a piece of sculpture, that would be a bust. So either a bust, 3-dimensional image, a sculpture, or a painting of a ruler, king or queen, from the neck and shoulders up. Is there rhythm in that? Anybody?
No.
Yeah, usually, again, we assume with normal intact human features, you're going to have 2 ears, 2 eyes, and hair sometimes, not in my case, but or their clothing. The top of their, jacket or their robes might have jewels, like Henry VIII always wore the most fancy outfits because he was, rich from stealing the money from what was then the Catholic Church of England and other places, and became the wealthiest ruler in Europe. So he was always dressing in ornate, fancy clothes, which had jewels embedded in them, and all kinds of necklaces, or so there'd be repeated shapes in his clothing, as there are in many other portraits. Yes, an individual human person is going to have rhythm. And then the final example, we just give brief 2 or 3 on each of these elements today, would be a landscape. Most landscapes are going to have multiple images of either trees, right, or rocks or mountains in the distance, right, with roughly, remember, does not be exactly the same shape. It just has to be very similar. And so the tops of mountain peaks, a jagged set of mountains across the horizon, even if all you see is their silhouette at sunset, a lot of romantic paintings did that. We'll see some in this class. That would be rhythm right there on the horizon. Multiple images of peak, sharp edged peaks in the distance or mountains, as would be a scene of a town, a cityscape or townscape, which is a kind of landscape, right? And so there would be maybe houses with similar roof lines and or windows and doors in each of the houses, or church spires, say several churches in that town. So rhythm is very common in art. Now, just to the point that one of your fellow students, if she's here now, she wants to acknowledge her contribution, because I appreciated that on Monday. Why would an artist use rhythm? Well, one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, is to draw a viewer's eye around the composition, to draw interest, to get them to look more carefully at that scene, or whatever it's a group portrait or landscape or townscape, because images which have roughly repeated shapes are by definition rhythmic, and that's a kind of visual rhythm which your eye follows around that composition, the painting, the photo, the drawing, or in a building, of course. Some architecture is lunkhead. A lot of it is. I don't like the modern glass and steel box style. We're going to cover that in this class. But whatever, most buildings have a variety of similar shapes. If nothing else, the windows usually are very similar, if not identical. So that by definition, most architecture has rhythm. And of course, sculpture of a human body or an animal or an object is going to usually have rhythm. So again, you need to give at least 3 examples of where you'd see those repeated or similar shapes. Okay. Now, line is pretty easy. I'm going to go up to the whiteboard for a moment. Again, my regular pointer disappeared. It's probably on the floor, but I want to go rooting around for it. So we're on number 4 already. We're doing pretty well here. Line there's several ways line can be used. Either as outlines, which would mean bold or thin are the 2 types of outlines. A couple of you sent me emails saying that you were painters, or you were interested in learning more about painting, and you were interested to see that the Michelangelo sculpture, Michelangelo painting I showed in the Zoom lecture on Wednesday had bold outline. It's one of his signatures or his types of features he used in all his paintings. Around all his human figures and his divine figures in heaven and what, he would put a bold outline so they'd stand out. So outlines can either be bold or thin. So I did kind of a minimal example of each. Or in many works of art, they're both. I mean, not at the same time, but there could be some parts of the painting where the figures are boldly outlined because they're the more important ones that the artist is trying to emphasize, that the artist wants you to notice, to stand out from the rest. And the other objects or figures around them might have thin outlines. That's very common. So look carefully and decide what you think is thin or bold, and give examples, at least 3, of how line, if there is outline. Now, some of you may write about abstract art, right? Like Jackson Pollock or something like that. You can write about any work of art, any style, any period, any artist that you want. Well, they don't usually use line as outline, but they might use line as the 3rd way you can use line, for shading, which is, I do a crosshatch, so I'm not going to redo it here in this square here. Shading, lines that overlap and crosshatch, it's called, technique of lines in a painting or drawing. Mostly those are the 2 where you'd see this type of line that creates a kind of line that you then don't see an outline for. That would be to make an area look darker than the rest of the objects around it. And finally, the third way line can be used, well, actually, there's two more, is in a sculpture, line is usually carved. So that would be, for instance, the statue of David by Michelangelo. We're definitely going to cover that. I think it's next week. Many other sculptures, of course. So in a work of sculpture, if it's a realistic work, especially if it's a human figure like David from the, the story from the Bible, the artist, the sculptor, in this case, Michelangelo, has made carved lines to create the images of the face, of the eyes, the mouth, the nose, ears, and of course the muscles in his body. So carved line is usually what you see and not painted or drawn in a sculpture. And then the final thing about line that can be used in a work of architecture, and you're going to have some, I guarantee there'll be architectural slides of architecture that you see if you look at your syllabus. I mean, it's pretty important to cover all the types of major, not every kind, but all the major architectural styles that are still influencing, buildings around the world, and where they came from, from the Renaissance all the way through to late 20th century or, current. And when we do that, you'll see how line in a building is usually not painted, and sometimes it's carved because some buildings have the name of the building carved in stone above the entrance, right? County courthouse, for instance, or jail or something, the public buildings often do that. But if there is no carved line, that doesn't mean there's no line in a building. The line is the edges, visual, it's called line, visual, visual, visual line in a building is what you see when you look at the building in real life or in a photo of a building, and it's the corners of the building that forms a visual line, or anything around the outer edges. Again, visual line would be in a building around the edges of the doors and windows, because of course that creates a kind of a boundary between the rest of the building, the front of it, and the window itself, or windows, and or the door. And the corners also create visual lines. So in a building, line is usually visual, but of course some buildings it's painted, in a few places it's plastered on with gold letters like TRUMP. There's a story I won't go into in Chicago about the mayor of Chicago, Trump's tower. He wanted it to be the tallest building in Chicago, which already had the tallest building, the Sears Tower in America, but he didn't get a permit for that. So instead he wanted his name 40 feet tall. He got his building. It's the second tallest building in Chicago. If you don't know Chicago, it's fantastic. It's the birthplace of the skyscraper. We'll cover that. Right on the Chicago River, prominent building, actually kind of nicely designed aesthetically. And he was asking for 40-foot tall letters of his name. And the mayor of Chicago said, you know what, even for your monumental ego, 20 feet tall is tall enough. So that's what he got, is 20-foot tall letters. So that would be line used as lettering, and it's not carved or painted, it's applied. But that's a rare case. You don't see that very often. Most buildings don't have the name of the person tacked on in metal or whatever material it is on top of the front of the building. That's an exception, unless you choose to write about a building like that, which you can. All right, let's take a pause. Does anybody have any questions? We're not quite halfway through, but we have a lot more than half to cover, because when you get to number 9, space, that's the longest of all the techniques, because it incorporates 6 different ways, at least in this class, that you'll need to use to describe techniques an artist could use. But we'll get to that near the end. Any questions about any of the first 4 elements so far? Okay.
No, not currently.
Sorry? Nope. Okay.
Oh, no,
I'm just
not
looking to
currently.
see if anyone's still trying to join us. Yeah, we don't have additional numbers, at least on my screen, that are sitting there waiting to be admitted. All right. So number 5, this is an easy one. People often miss this and ignore it, and then get several points off, and that makes a difference sometimes between an A and a B, or a B and a C on their papers. Mass or masses. The other way to say it is volume. Masses or volume is so I have it written down here, as you see if you go to number 6, is the relative size of different objects. So masses or volume, how do you analyze that? You look and see what are the largest objects or parts in a work of art. Identify the 3, see here's again the 3 rule, 3 examples of each of these elements. Now, some of these elements won't be in certain modern types of paintings, there's, like I just said, there's no line, but there could be, because Jackson Pollock, some of you know what I'm talking about. If not, we're covering him toward the end of the semester. Dripped paint along canvases as he walked around the canvas, or even was on a catapult above it, you know. Jack the Dripper is a corny nickname he had. First American painter to earn over $500,000 for one of his works while he was alive was Jackson Pollock. Anyway, point is that line? Well, yeah, it is kind of, because if it's a continuous, right, it's just not outlined. It'd be line as, you know, paint continuously forming a line along part of that canvas. And you could find more than, he did hundreds of such dripped lines. So yeah, line can exist in an abstract or modern painting, but not as outlined. Okay, so with masses, it's pretty easy. Just identify, in this class, I'm only requiring, I'm not saying it's the only way to analyze mass, but the easiest way is when you look at the parts of a work of art, or if it's a building, the different sections. So now I'm going to go to one of my cornier drawings up in the upper left corner. Some of you may have noticed it and wonder, what is that? It's supposed to be King Kong climbing to the spire of the Empire State Building. How many versions of King Kong? And there's a new one that just came out, isn't it? Yeah, there's the Jack Black one, and then there's the best of all 1933 black and white original King Kong, and the one from the 70s with Jeff Bridges. They're all pretty good. Anyway, so what you have here is, let's say you're analyzing the mass of the skyscraper. So let's call it the Empire State Building, doesn't matter. Well, there are three major masses in the Empire State Building, or many skyscrapers, not all. Some of them are just a shaft and a single mass. That's all they are. The kind of building I just described that I don't care for, modern glass and steel box, that's only going to have a single mass. So it's pretty easy. Then you just say there aren't a second and third largest mass in this because, and then you describe the reason it's a single mass. But here, most buildings have more than one section or one area. And so the base, I think, is 20 stories tall on the Empire State Building, would be one of those three masses. Then the shaft, which is clearly the largest, I don't know if it's clear on my poor drawing here, it's 80 stories. That's a massive mass section of the building. So that would have the largest mass. The second largest mass would be the base, the first 20 stories. And then the smallest mass would be the spire, which of course, poor King Kong tried to cling to before he was shot down by airplanes, right? According to all the film versions, I think, of his death. Anyway, the point is, in a building, mass is the sections of the building. And you just look for the three largest sections. Some buildings have multiple areas or sections, and therefore there's more than three masses. Most buildings, you can identify at least three parts or sections, and which are the largest three. That's all you have to do. And with a painting or a drawing or a photo, it's pretty obvious. Now, in a sculpture, mass, if it's a single human body, like David, the statue of Michelangelo's David, well, that's a single mass, except if you look more closely, he's got a slingshot. I think it's over his shoulder, yeah. And he's got a rock in one hand. So there are three masses there. The largest is clearly his body. It's a single mass. Then the slingshot, and then the rock. So sometimes you have to look a little more closely, of course, to make sure that you're not overlooking, what are the second or third largest sections. Even in sculpture, there usually is more than just the human body. Maybe they're the clothing, or if it's a soldier or warrior, especially Renaissance sculpture, they're going to have armor on, right? A helmet or a shield and a sword. So there'll be enough examples in most of the slides in this class. You'll see whether they're a sculpture, painting, architecture, drawing, or photography, there's going to be more than three sections or three parts, and you can describe the three largest. It's a pretty simple technique of the elements. It's one of the easiest to identify. All right, moving on. Now we're going to go to textures. Textures, there are two major types of textures. One is simulated. You see, I want to make sure you understand there's no T in it. It's not stimulated, but simulated textures is when an artist uses, and this is mentioned in here, down, let's see, I put it as number 5. When line, color, and shading are used by an artist to create the illusion of real textures. You could add that in the margin if you want. In other words, simulated textures is creating an illusion with paint, right? Or ink or chalk, whatever material the artist uses to create that painting or drawing that imitates, say, human skin tone or human skin, and hair and clothing, or metal if it's someone's wearing armor, or if it's a landscape. Simulated textures are going to, right, create the illusions, if it's a realistic style landscape, of rocks and maybe dirt, grass, trees, the tree trunk, the leaves. There's plenty of examples in almost every work you're going to write about in this class, more than 3 of simulated textures. That's if that work of art is a realistic image. When it's abstract, the textures then might be, let's go back to Jackson Pollock, the actual texture of the paint, and then the canvas where he didn't paint over it, where some sections of the canvas are blank and then he has his drippings of paint. So that'd be only 2 and they'd be real textures. So sometimes there aren't 3 textures or simulated textures in a work of art. But most works we're going to study in this class for the first 80% of this are realistic style. And that applies to painting or sculpture or drawings. Now, with a building, the textures are not usually simulated sometimes, but usually they are what they appear to be. We covered this with the last slide of Frank Lloyd Wright. And when I repost that lecture or do post it, you'll see if you go to the end of that, how those are the real textures in that building he did, the Guggenheim Museum, the real textures of concrete, glass, and metal. So buildings usually are not simulated textures, but almost every building has more than 1 or 2 materials. So you look at the materials, and you should be able to find that by researching about the building. If you are actually looking at the real building or haven't ever been to the building you're writing about, you'll find it usually on, online research. So what are the materials the building's made out of? Well, glass, steel, and concrete are all smooth, real textures. That's how you write about that. And there's 3 examples right there. The concrete is one smooth texture. Then and you'd say where. Don't forget, you got to say where each of these elements you're identifying and analyzing appears in that work of art, whether it's a building or sculpture. Now, photographs, some people might find kind of difficult to apply this technique, but with a photo, yeah, the textures are simulated because it's ink or whatever the material is for pixels, if it's a digital image, on paper or on a screen or wherever that image, that photo has been reproduced. So there is simulated texture. And again, in a realistic photo where nothing is blurry or out of focus, then the textures are sharp. So the textures would be simulated if they're in a painting or photo or drawing. If they're very realistic, the best way to say it is sharp, or you can just say realistic if you prefer. Simulated textures are in this painting. Let's go back to Henry VIII, the portrait I mentioned. There's so many of him, but any of his portraits will show simulated texture on his clothing, more on his beard and hair, and then more simulated textures on his skin, done with paint, of course. And they're all realistic because he was living in the Renaissance when painters were all doing realistic style portraits. Okay, so you'd say that those 3 examples would be your 3 sentences, your 3 examples you need to get full credit if you're writing about a painting, a realistic portrait. Okay, now any questions before we move on to, because the last 3 are a little more complicated. Do we have someone that still needs? No, we don't. New. All right, so color. Well, let me do it in the order it's up here on this whiteboard. Modeling. This one is a pretty easy one, relatively. Modeling is when an artist, here we go, it's down number 9 on this list on your handouts, right? So you should be taking a look at the definitions I wrote out for you as we go. Modeling, the use of contrasting areas of light and dark or shading to create the illusion of a 3-dimensional object. So the best I could do is a giant ball of stone, let's say, in a Renaissance garden. There's a lot of these, and if you go to Italy and you see Renaissance palaces or museums, the grounds around, the gardens around, they almost all have these giant balls. I guess it's simulating the fact that people finally figured out the world was round in the, after Columbus's voyage. And after that, of course, all over the world, people would have known the world is round. So let's say you're doing a globe or whatever you want to call it, a ball of stone symbolize the earth. Well, during the time of day when the sun's coming from, see where I put the arrow there, right, from the lower left onto that object, the part where the sun's hitting it is going to be light, and then the modeling or darker sections are going to be on the other side of that object. Therefore, if you squint, maybe sort of as bad as my art is, nonetheless, you get some idea of that concept, I think, from this drawing, that if you use that technique correctly in a painting or a drawing, and it could be in a photo too, modeling then creates the illusion of 3 dimensions. Now, with a building, modeling would be the shadows, if there are any, in the recesses of the doors or windows. So modeling on a building is not a technique, it's just the natural shadows created by the sun. And you can find usually, at least in almost every photo I've seen of a building, you're going to see shadows in different parts of it, at least 3 different areas where you can say there's natural modeling created by the sun in the door. And then again, whatever the windows or maybe the awning above the entrance or something creates, but that's not a technique, that's just nature creating modeling naturally. So you'd say it's natural modeling from the sun, or the shadows created by the sun. But with sculpture, modeling is usually not as obvious, but there is some places where sculpture is displayed where the lighting creates modeling. And if you see that, that's what you'd write about. Say, in this photo I'm using for this work of art, this sculpture, there are shadows around this person's face or around their eyes and their mouth or around their hands created by the museum lighting. That's how you write. But there are usually several different types of modeling in sculpture, whereas in a painting, modeling can be either soft. There are 2 main types of modeling in a painting or drawing, where shadows or dark and light contrasting areas are used, with paint, chalk, whatever it is, watercolor that the artist is using to create that image. They're either going to be sharp and realistic or soft and diffused. And I wrote that in here under modeling, sharp or soft. And you can use the word diffused. Remember, that's D-I-F-F, not D-E-F. It's not a bomb about to go off. Diffused as modeling is very, very common with every style of painting every painting in the style we call Impressionism. We're going to cover that. Of course, we're covering that. And goes after Impressionism, but he also used modeling. In other words, painters started making less sharp and realistic modeling in their paintings, starting in like the mid 1800s or even early 1800s. You'll see that as we go along when we get to the 19th century painters, Impressionists, Romantic painters, post-Impressionists, and then sometimes there's no modeling at all. Again, back to Jackson Pollock with his drifts of colors and drift lines. There's no modeling there unless he overlaps some different darker and lighter colors, but he didn't do that deliberately. So really you could say there's just no modeling. And in that case, you wouldn't have to write 3 examples because there aren't 3. But most works of art you're going to write about will have plenty of examples of where modeling is used. And you need to say not just where, but is it sharp or soft, or in other words, realistic or diffused. Soft and diffused, those are synonyms. I'm going to pause now. Any questions? All right, color, we started to talk about it, but we didn't get into it. So I wrote it out for you in detail, number 8 on your list. And obviously I'm not with a black and white board and black marker, I'm not going to illustrate it. So just using your minds and your imaginations, you can all visualize these elements. But I actually am going to show you an example. I forgot that my wife has a print where the color effects of different colors are evident. And I'll hold it up to the screen in just a minute. Okay, color is the use of warm colors, which are earth tones, and I've listed the main ones right here. These colors are all considered warm because they come from the earth or things in the earth. Red, yellow, orange, gold, brown, and pink, or any combination of those colors can create warm colors. Cool tones are pretty much limited to these 4 types of colors, or shades of them: blue, green, gray, or white. So warm, why would an artist do that? Because warm tones appear first in the viewer's eye. They appear to advance toward a viewer when you see something that has a warm color, especially if it's in contrast in the same work of art, in the same painting or drawing, with cool tones around it. And that's why the artist would do that, because they want you to notice the warm toned parts or object in a painting or drawing first. That's what the artist wants you to notice first. It's a subconscious human reaction. Of course, that doesn't apply if someone is colorblind. That would be the exception. But if you have normal color vision, you will notice it. It's not a voluntary, it's an involuntary reaction. Warm colors stand out first, or appear, the other way to say it, appear to advance toward the viewer or in their viewer's eyesight, whereas cool colors recede or are noticed after the warm colors. Whereas black and white are neutral. Now, one of your fellow students, I think you recall on Monday last week, mentioned value. We're going to talk about value, like I said, either probably, I'm guessing, on Monday, a week from today, a little bit, more than a little, but it's not one of the elements that I decided to include in the 10. I think 10 is enough to start with for a beginning level course, but we will talk about it. And some of you are accomplished artists from your many bios, I can see that, or just studied art enough. So we'll briefly describe how value applies to a work of art, but this is not what now we're just talking about warm versus cool, or the third category of color is neutral, where it's a work of art is black and white, or shades of black, white, and gray, like the Picasso's painting of Guernica. We're going to see that painting again at the end of today's lecture, because I will use two slides to describe this relatively new technique I haven't had in the past, proportion number 10. We'll get to that at the end. So once again, how do you recognize, or how do I prove to you, illustrate, let's do it right now, how warm and cool colors look contrasting with each other in the same work of art? Well, hang on, I have to go grab this print. It's from the cover of a magazine. I think it's still in print, actually. And I know there's reflections. It's not much I can do about that, except maybe there, that might be better, even though it's at an angle. Let's see. That's getting a little bit. You don't need to read the title. There we go. Okay, this is the cover of a magazine. The artist wanted you to notice the warm colors, the object that he or she painted. It is a painting, by the way, print from a painting of a house in, some suburb or in the countryside, that the artist wants you to see first the house. So you can see warm colors, specifically yellow and red for the walls and roof of the house. And you clearly notice those first. So it's just an automatic reaction, sorry. And then what's around it? Well, there's a light blue bit of sky, there's white clouds, and there's different shades of green for the grass and the trees. Those are all cool colors. And the white picket fence too. Your typical stereotype house with a picket fence. Always white picket fence. Nobody ever paints them another color. But anyway, well, sometimes they're cast iron, but this one is white, painted white. So you notice as you look, if you squint, it's even easier to see the point I'm trying to illustrate with this drawing, which is that the warm colors stand out and the cool colors around the house, the fence, the garden, or grass, and the trees and the sky behind it are fading, not fading, but they are last to be noticed. They are the last thing your eyes notice compared to the warm colors that contrast with them. And that's exactly the reason an artist would use contrasting warm and cool colors in the same work of art. Okay, I hope that's cool. All human skin tones are considered warm, by the way, all human skin tones. So that's a given. You don't have to, try to analyze that. If there's a portrait of a person or a group of people, all of the skin tones visible are going to be considered warm. Okay, we're doing pretty well, but we still have two more, and these are a little more complicated. Space. So on my list that I gave you, that handout, it's number 7. But on the board, I'm gonna have to stand up to illustrate some of these. I've listed the 6 main ways that space can be used in a work of art, or should I say depicted in a work of art. So let's see. With this, let's start with the most simple or earliest technique of space, depicting space in a 2-dimensional work of art. Overlapping, I think that's self-explanatory, right? When there's 2 or more objects in a painting, a drawing, a sculpture, what have you, or a photo, the object that is overlapping the other objects behind it is meant to be closer to the viewer or to appear closer. And those objects being overlapped are the ones meant to appear further away. I think that's pretty straightforward, right? So that one, I don't think I need to go into any more detail. Register line is another technique that's pretty simple, and ancient Egyptians used it a lot, but so did some other cultures, the Babylonians and some other Mediterranean cultures used it, and some other parts of the world, Africa and Asia, you might still see this technique. Register line. Okay, register line is when you have 2 or more objects. Let's say it's human beings. I know these are stick figures, best I could do, where the figure on the lowest line or object, whatever it is, in this case, it's supposed to be a human running on the lowest line, supposed to be closer or appear to be closer to the viewer. And then if you want to have objects appear smaller, and you're using this technique, register line, you put the objects that are meant to look further away on upper lines. It's a very simplistic technique. It's not very realistic, but it works well enough that artists for thousands of years use these techniques to, like, especially with a panel of sculpture, bas-relief panels from ancient Egypt. Some of you took art 1.1, right? Or 2.1, you may already have covered this. When you go see the exhibit, if any of you do, for extra credit on Egyptian art, the Pharaoh's Gold, you'll see probably almost certainly some examples of this technique. So that's a fairly simple one. You're not likely to see it in fact, the slides in this class, we're not going to see it because we're starting from the Renaissance and moving forward. Well, you might a little bit. Yeah, a little bit in some of the art from other cultures. Okay, diminishing size is a similar kind of thing. It's also a very simple and, fairly easy to recognize technique for depicting space or distance, if you want to say distance or depth in a work of art. The same thing as depicting space is a way of depicting depth or distance of objects in a 2-dimensional work of art. So how does diminishing size work? Well, it's probably obvious, but if it isn't, here we have another 3 stick figures where the largest figures are meant to look closer to the viewer and the smaller figures are meant to look further away or appear to be further away. Okay, and then foreshortening, this one is a realistic technique that's been used for at least several hundred years. Actually, some ancient Egyptian and well, certainly ancient Greek and Roman artists did this, but we're not covering that here. So you'll see it in a lot of the Renaissance painting and in other parts of the world as well. A foreshortening, and this I believe I defined on here, I think I did, is when an artist makes the part of an object closest to the viewer, that part of an object that is closest to the viewer. So let's say it's a stone fallen down, Stonehenge. You all know what Stonehenge looks like, right? Everyone's seen pictures of Stonehenge. So those giant stones, some of them fall flat on the ground, have been fallen for thousands of years. So let's say you're looking at a painting or a photo of Stonehenge. And so the parts of the stones that are closest to the viewer are going to be shown wider in foreshortening if you're using that technique, or the artist is. And the parts of that object farthest away from the viewer will appear narrower than those closest. So if you have a long, object, whatever it is, a tree, a fallen tree, or you know, a fence, right? A railing of some kind, or even a building where, you know, you see the long side section of a building in a painting, a photo, a drawing. Foreshortening is almost, if it's a realistic style work of art, is almost always present. And you can identify more usually than one section of a painting where you see foreshortening. If you just notice one section of that object, the part looking supposed to look closest to us is wider, the part further away is narrow, just as it appears to our eyes in human vision. Again, assuming you know full vision and depth perception. So foreshortening is again also pretty straightforward. Now we'll get to atmospheric perspective. I actually think, if I recall, I wrote this out. I didn't used to on your handout here. Yeah, I did. Here we go. Everyone look at number 7. If this is an important technique, you're going to see a lot of this in the next lecture after we get, you know, starting on Wednesday and from that point on. Atmospheric perspective is a technique for depicting space, you know, in a two-dimensional work of art, in which objects farther away from the viewer appear bluer and hazier than those objects closest to the viewer. I'll say that again. It's a technique in which the artist depicts objects furthest away from the viewer as bluer and hazier than those objects closest to the viewer. It's how we really see distance. Again, assuming you're not colorblind, if you have normal full color vision. I'll give you a good example. Drive across the Cotati Grade in the daytime. Be careful about the cars in the lanes next to you. So don't only do this when there's no cars around you, and it's safe to take a quick glance towards the Pacific Ocean to the west, of course. It's especially noticeable in the late afternoon or early morning, but even at high noon, you'll see this. The mountains in the distance, they always look bluer and hazier than anything closer up. And the Cotati Grade, of course, what's right below it? Everyone knows farms, right? A bunch of farms. One of which is a pumpkin patch, I think, in October that I used to take my daughter to. Anyway, so what you have is the bluest kind of look in the distant mountains, and then a little less so maybe on the foothills or the grasslands at the base of the mountains. And by the time you get closer to your view, in this case, the Cotati, of course, you're about 101, the freeway, you won't see the blue hazy effect. It's how the actual air behaves. I mean, it's what happens. The air has particles in it. Of course, it's not, you know, we'd be dead if there weren't particles in the air, oxygen, among other things, moisture, of course, on a rainy day or a humid day. So all of these different particles in the air, further away they are from us, they cause a kind of a hazy blue look over the objects that are in the distance. It's just a natural effect of the atmosphere. That's why it's called atmospheric perspective. The first culture to do that consisting were the Romans. And we're not covering them, but the Romans did really realistic atmospheric perspective. I've been to many Roman villas, paintings on the walls of villas in Italy, and you might choose to write about one of those. There's some fascinating works of art. Atmospheric perspective didn't really exist much before ancient, maybe a little bit in ancient Greece. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they didn't use it. Okay, so the last technique is the most realistic, and you're going to see a lot of this, and we will, starting on Wednesday when we do our first Renaissance paintings, you'll see this technique, scientific perspective. What does that mean? Well, I wrote it out for you here at the bottom of the list of space techniques, number 7, of course. And that is when scientific perspective is when an artist draws diagonal lines onto a composition that all meet at a common vanishing point on the horizon. I'll say it again. And this is a technique in which an artist draws diagonal lines onto a composition that all meet at a common vanishing point on the horizon. Do we see that? We don't see the lines. Normally they're painted over. In a painting, they're usually drawn with a pencil or chalk and then painted over. Sometimes you'll see the lines in the painting, but that's rare. Usually it's what the artist does when they start doing their study, right? Some of you know this from taking art composition classes. And so the lines are not usually visible, but they're there. If a technique like this is used, the scientific perspective, you'll see a common vanishing point. And I do that here. And the diagonal lines, like I said, may not be visible, but if they're used properly, they draw your eye to the horizon, and the objects fade in size as they are further away from us. It's the only very accurate, the most accurate way of depicting space in a two-dimensional work of art. With a building, space is real. So if you were writing about a building, you get 0 points on this section paper if you said there's no techniques for space used here. Of course not. A building isn't a depiction of space. Remember, architecture is space. It's enclosed. There's a definition, 2 words. Definition of architecture. All architects know this definition, or at least the ones I've ever talked to and studied. Enclosed space. That's the definition of all architecture. No matter whether it's a nomadic tribes, teepee, which can hold sometimes 3 or 4 families. There's some huge ones. I've seen them in paintings and photos of the frontier before the end of native culture's independence, right? Some of you know what I mean about that. It's huge. Some people think teepees were just a little tiny conical structures. They could be huge. Anyway, they're whatever size their architecture, all the way up to the biggest skyscraper. And all of those have in common that they enclose space. So in a building, you write about the actual size of the different rooms or sections. With a teepee, it's pretty obvious. It's one large, whatever the height of the teepee is, conical space, which has room for whatever number of people, if you chose to write about that as a work of art for your research papers. You're going to see, let's see, Miwok and Pomo Indian structures that I've taken slides of and wrote an article about for Marin Magazine. They're reproduced because the original one's all gone, but they're a good example of architecture where there's no technique for a space. It's the actual wooden, in that case, those are made out of wood, redwood usually, wooden structure shaped in whatever shape it is, conical, square, rectangular. Okay, so the last technique here, we are going to go, and I'll bet I'll have to go back because I'll bet I lost the screen share when everything, no, I didn't, yay. Okay, I hope you guys can see this. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Need someone to confirm. Yeah. So let's get it full size because we're going to end up with just 2 works of art to describe. This technique is new, not to me personally, but to this course. Proportion and scale, they have a similarity, but they're different. So here we go. It's number 10. I wrote the definition out on the handout. You should be able to see it. Proportion is the relative size of the various parts of an object in a work of art. And we'll do scale after that. So let's just stop with that. Let's do first proportion. This is Picasso's Guernica. I already told you what it was. I'm not going to ask you to take notes on it now, unless you want to, about this as an example of proportion, which standard proportion, realistic painting. This is not realistic. Remember, we covered that when we discussed it on Wednesday last week. So in a realistic painting, standard proportion is used, and that means that the parts of an object or the actual sections of a person's body or whatever are normal or accurate in size compared to reality. So let's look at this. Here's a dead soldier, and his arm is huge. His arm is stretched out here, right? Let's see. I think I can. Yeah, there we go. His arm and even his hand is as big as his head. Of course, that's not normal, not accurate or realistic proportion. So why did Picasso use these? Altered is the word for that. Altered is what you'd say. There's an altered proportion in this painting, and there's several. We'll do 3 examples so you have that concept that you need to get 3 if you're writing a paper about work like this. So Picasso uses altered proportion on this in this painting on the arm and hand of the dead soldier. Why? Because he wants to emphasize how he died. He died in pain, clearly. This was a bombing raid. Remember, I covered that on Wednesday, that the Nazis and the Italian fascists, their Air Force bombed this defenseless village, killing thousands of people, mostly poor peasants in their homes. They had no way to protect themselves. So some of them ran out into the streets and tried to get away, but many of them died. So you see, this is why Picasso used this, where the little cursor is here. He wanted us to notice the pain and suffering of the dead soldier. He did the same thing with this woman's leg. She's trying to get away from a burning building. And he obviously exaggerates, or in other words, uses altered proportion. And even her knee, look at how the knee goes down almost to the ground. But the foot, clearly the foot is twice as big as her other foot. None of them are very accurate and realistic, but the most noticeable one is the one I'm picking in this figure of the woman running out of a burning building. Is her, I guess it would be her right foot and the bottom half of her right leg. Those again are altered proportion. And Picasso, once again, why did you do that? To emphasize the, suffering. This woman looks like she's already been injured. One of her legs, maybe, who knows, will have to be amputated if she survives. He is emphasizing the suffering of the victims of this. And then here we have one more example of altered proportion. A woman trying to escape from the upper floor of the same, looks like the same burning building as this woman, where the neck, right, there is almost, you could somebody say there is no neck. Well, the sort of is her head and neck, but obviously the part behind her ear here is not at all realistic. It's altered proportion. So he's emphasizing her screaming or crying face and head, de-emphasizing her neck. And then he's also making his arm way longer than any human arm ever has been, unless you're talking about the Fantastic Four. And so you have this arm stretching out with a lamp, and that arm is emphasized also because she's trying to, it happened at night, by the way. So people were, terrified and trying to rush into the dark night and see their neighbors being dead or dying on the ground. So he's emphasizing their terror, their suffering, their pain. Okay, so that's several examples in one painting of altered proportion. But what about scale? Well, then this work, it's not one you have to take notes on, okay, because it's not part of the period we cover. It's from ancient Greece. I'll tell you the name of it. It's Laocoon. If you want to know the name, I'll spell it, but you don't have to write this. Laocoon, Laocoon. Laocoon and his sons. Laocoon was being crushed in this sculpture of him. He's the father, the central figure, is being crushed by a sea serpent because the Greek gods were punishing him for trying to warn the Trojans about the Trojan horse. He tried to warn the Greeks' enemies not to take that horse into the city. So for that act of defiance, the Greek gods, of course, were trying to get the Greeks to win. So they punished him by crushing him to death before he could say that. So what is this an example of? Scale. Scale is the relative size of different objects, not parts of a single object. Again, it's the relative size of different objects in a work of art. Well, that's exactly what we see here. The father is out of scale, or you could say it the other way around. There's two sons. They were fully grown adults. They're not little kids. They are half his size. So the scale here is not realistic, not normal, therefore altered, deliberately to emphasize the father, who is the central figure here, and of course the one the Greeks wanted to punish, but also to emphasize his pain, emotional pain, because what's happening is he realizes he's not only caused his own death, but his own sons by defying the Greek gods, and they're all three being punished because of his disobedience. So he's emotionally and physically in pain. And that's emphasized by him being shown so large, his head and body are larger than theirs. And the victims are shown smaller. So that's an example of altered scale. Okay, we have done well. We end right about 4:30. I know that's later than we usually will, but we needed to do that to make up for that interruption. So any questions, I'm going to now stop the share, because now you have, this is my unofficial office hours, the opportunity to ask questions about anything relating to what we just covered. Again, this won't be completely clear. Don't worry if it isn't yet, all 9 elements, maybe some more than others from my sort of introductory comments and my drawing and the notes, but they will be much clearer as you read through each chapter on each of these techniques in Gill's book, The Critic Sees. I didn't include another book, but I put it on reserve that covers proportion and scale. And I'll mention it because it's on the handout, but in case it's not obvious, it's on reserve if you want to go. You can't take it out of the library, but both the Petaluma and Santa Rosa libraries have Art Matters by Sarah, I think it was Sarah Gordon. It's a new book. I bought it this summer on the recommendation of a past department chair who created the new guidelines. So that's not a bad book to look at when it comes to the elements that we aren't going to require you to write about, but it does also give you a nice section, I think it's 3 pages or 4, maybe 4, on a scale, and also another section on proportion. And you can just look those up in the index of that book. It's a very, I didn't want to require it. It's $150. See, you guys have enough expenses as it is. So you could just look at it on reserve or maybe find a used copy if you're that into it. But proportion and scale are the only 2 techniques not given a full chapter each in Sarah Gill's book, which is why I put on reserve the book that does have them is Art Matters by Pamela Gordon. It's at both libraries on reserve shelf. I think there's 2 copies at each library. So anyway, but I gave you a description and examples here, hopefully to get at least an overall idea of what those 2 terms mean. We covered a lot. And you've been patient. I want to thank you. I know we lost a few people along the way, one way or another. But again, you'll see this posted on YouTube by 8 p.m. Friday. But I think I'll say by 8 p.m. tonight, I will repost that the second lecture from last week. Might want to leave me an email. Also, if you didn't hear me call your name because you joined the class later, I still have just the printout of the first week's roster. I want to print one every time I mean, that would be like a waste of paper. So I'm going to print the final roster on week 4, but I will count you as in the class. Absolutely. If you didn't hear your name, just send me an email and say you just joined. I think that's only 2, maybe 3 people that applies to. Or if you didn't send your mini bio in and you didn't hear me call your name, then you should do that. Send the mini bio in and just explain it. I didn't hear my name, but here's my mini bio. That way you're counted as completely enrolled in the class and no risk of being dropped, okay? All right, so now questions anybody has about anything we covered? It's a lot of material, I know, but hopefully you get a better idea after this lecture than you would have had before about any of these techniques and how you need to apply them to your analysis. We're actually going to talk about how to write the paper in detail next week. And I'll give you concrete examples of what a paper should look like. An A paper, of course. All right, one more time. Anybody have any questions? It could even be about anything other than what we talked about today relating to the class. Well, thank you for your patience, your contributions, and your attention. So I'll see you all on Wednesday, and we have a lot of new slides to cover. So we want to get right to that. So I'm not going to take roll again until the 4th week when we have to. It's called the census roster. But like I said, please email me if you didn't hear your name today. All right, you guys, that's it. One more time. Anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you all. Thank you. Have a good 2 days. I'll see you at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. All right. Okay.